In the 1990s, in a Russian city built around a single factory, men were being murdered for the right to sell a car. Not a Ferrari, not a Rolls-Royce, a boxy, underpowered sedan that took its owners years of saving to afford, and then years more on a waiting list to receive. The Lada. By the time the killing slowed, investigators would link a single criminal network to at least 65 murders, all to control the cars rolling out of one factory. That factory was AvtoVAZ, and at its peak, it was one of the largest car plants on Earth. It had been built, improbably, by the Soviet Union with the help of an Italian capitalist corporation in a city named after an Italian communist. It would put more than 30 million cars on the roads of an empire whose leaders had once been deeply suspicious of private cars at all. And in 2022, after surviving communism, gangsters, and near bankruptcy, this Soviet giant was handed to the Russian state for a reported price of 1 ruble. And then it began building cars without airbags. How do you build a car empire from almost nothing, lose it to the Mafia, and give it away for less than the price of a loaf of bread? This is the story of the people's car. Welcome to Iron Curtain Industries. Chapter 1. The country with no cars. To understand why men would later kill over a Lada, you have to understand how badly the Soviet Union needed one. By the late 1950s, the United States had become a nation on wheels. Tens of millions of private cars filled American driveways and highways. In the Soviet Union, the private car barely existed. For most citizens, owning one was a distant dream. Cars were for officials, for institutions, for the state. And for a time, that was the plan. Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev was openly cool toward a future of private car ownership. The official preference leaned toward shared and rental fleets, cars as a public service, not a personal possession. But ideology ran into reality. As the 1960s arrived, the Soviet leadership faced a quiet crisis of expectations. Citizens could see, in films, in magazines, in glimpses of the West, that ordinary people elsewhere were driving their own cars. A superpower that could put a satellite into orbit could not put its own people behind the wheel. When Leonid Brezhnev took power in 1964, with Alexei Kosygin as his premier, the emphasis shifted. The economic reforms of 1965 pushed the system, at least on paper, toward consumer goods and a higher standard of living. The decision was made. The Soviet Union would build a car for the people, a modern car, millions of them. There was just one problem. The Soviet Union didn't really know how to mass-produce a modern passenger car. To build the people's car, the workers' state would have to turn to the capitalist West. Chapter 2. A deal with the other side. In the mid-1960s, Soviet negotiators went looking for a partner who could build them a car factory from the ground up. They found one in Italy, at Fiat. Fiat had exactly what the Soviets lacked: a modern, mass-producible design and the expertise to build the enormous plant to make it. Its new model, the Fiat 124, had just been crowned European Car of the Year. In 1966, the two sides signed their agreement. A communist superpower and an Italian carmaker, Cold War adversaries on paper, had agreed to build the Soviet Union's car future together. The total cost ran to roughly $800 million. The factory would rise on the banks of the Volga River, in a city with a fitting name. 2 years earlier, the old town of Stavropol on Volga had been renamed Tolyatti, in honor of Palmiro Togliatti, the long-serving leader of the Italian Communist Party. An Italian car would now be built in a Soviet city named for an Italian communist. Construction began in 1967. What went up was staggering in scale. A plant sprawling across hundreds of hectares, with well over 100 miles of production lines, and around it, a brand new city for the workers who would run it. The Fiat 124 itself was not simply copied. Soviet engineers reworked it for a harsher world, somewhere around 800 modifications in all. They raised the suspension for rough roads, thickened the steel, and fitted a new engine the Italians had never used. On the 19th of April 1970, the first cars rolled off the line, just days before the 100th anniversary of Lenin's birth. The car was called the VAZ 2101. The people would give it a far more affectionate name. Chapter 3. The People's Car. Officially, it was the VAZ 2101, nicknamed the Zhiguli, after the hills near the factory. But to millions of Soviet citizens, it became the kopeka, the little kopeck, the smallest coin in the currency. Because for an ordinary Soviet family, a kopeka was anything but small. To buy a Lada, you didn't simply walk into a dealership. There were no dealerships. You put your name down, often through your workplace or trade union, and you waited. Waiting lists stretched for years. Depending on the era, a buyer might wait up to a decade for delivery, and the price was steep, the cost of several years of an average worker's wages. A car, in the Soviet Union, was not transport, it was a milestone. And because cars were so scarce, a used Lada could sell for more than a new one, the rare consumer good that gained value the moment you owned it. The factory grew into a giant. Production climbed from tens of thousands of cars to hundreds of thousands a year. Its workforce swelled to well over 100,000 people. For export, the brand was renamed Lada, partly because foreign buyers struggled with Zhiguli. Ladas went out across the Eastern Bloc and then beyond it, into Western Europe and even Britain, where a no-frills sedan badged the Lada Niva became one of the cheapest new cars money could buy. In Britain, the Niva turned into a national punchline, and yet people bought them by the tens of thousands because they were rugged, roomy, and astonishingly cheap. There was real engineering pride here too. In 1977, AvtoVAZ launched the Lada Niva, a compact go-anywhere 4x4, widely credited as one of the first mass-produced off-roaders with permanent four-wheel drive. The Niva proved almost unkillable. It climbed mountains, crossed deserts, and served polar expeditions. Decades later, it would still be rolling off the line. Add it all up, and the numbers are staggering. Since 1970, AvtoVAZ has built more than 30 million cars. Even today, Ladas make up roughly a third of all the cars on Russia's roads. By any measure, the people's car was a triumph, and then, the country that built it ceased to exist. Chapter 4. When the Empire Fell. In 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed, and the factory that had been the pride of Soviet industry suddenly found itself standing in a country with no rules. Overnight, the system that had organized everything, the state orders, the fixed prices, the waiting lists, was gone. In its place came something Russia had never experienced: raw, unregulated capitalism, arriving all at once in a nation with almost no laws to govern it. And AvtoVAZ was a tempting prize. In an economy where money was collapsing and goods were scarce, a finished Lada was almost as good as cash. One man understood that faster than almost anyone. His name was Boris Berezovsky. A mathematician by training, Berezovsky had founded a company called AvtoVAZ in 1989, one of the first private car dealers in the country. As inflation spiraled out of control, his company would take Ladas from the factory on credit, sell them immediately for hard value, and then pay AvtoVAZ back later, in rubles that inflation had quietly stripped of much of their worth. The factory delivered real cars. It got back shrinking money. Then Berezovsky went further. In 1993, he launched a grand public venture, promising to build an entirely new people's car. Ordinary Russians were invited to invest, and something like $50 million poured in. The new factory was never built, and Berezovsky used it all as a launch pad into media, into oil, into the inner circle of President Boris Yeltsin himself. He would become the archetype of an entirely new Russian figure, the oligarch. His fortune had started with a Lada. But Berezovsky was, in a sense, the respectable face of what was happening to AvtoVAZ. Out in Tolyatti, far from Moscow's boardrooms, the fight for the factory was about to turn violent. Because if a Lada was as good as cash, then controlling the Ladas was worth killing for. Chapter 5. The Tolyatti Wars. In the 1990s, the city of Tolyatti earned a grim nickname, Russia's Detroit. Not for the scale of what it built, but for how many people died fighting over it. When the Soviet state collapsed, it didn't simply stop running AvtoVAZ. It left a vacuum. And into that vacuum stepped the only organizations ruthless and organized enough to fill it: the criminal gangs. They understood the factory better than any economist. They grasped that the real money wasn't in making the cars, it was in controlling what happened to them, who got to buy them at the low official price, who distributed them, who ran the vast trade in spare parts. By the mid-1990s, all of it had fallen largely under criminal control, working hand in hand with insiders. The schemes were brazen. Gangs would take finished cars straight from the assembly line on credit and never pay for them. By some accounts, a single criminal group came to control around half the cars leaving the plant, with income running into the hundreds of millions of dollars a year. Because a finished Lada, in the Russia of the 1990s, was almost as good as a brick of cash. And so the factory became a prize worth killing for. What followed was a war. Rival gangs fought, street by street, for control of the cars and the money they represented. The founder of one of the most powerful groups was shot dead in 1992. The man who took his place would himself be gunned down in his car 6 years later. Around them, the killing spread. Managers, dealers, enforcers, rivals, picked off one after another. The numbers are chilling, though they have to be read carefully, because different counts measure different things. In 1997, Russia's Interior Ministry launched a major crackdown, codenamed Operation Cyclone, and its investigators tied criminal groups connected to AvtoVAZ to at least 65 murders. Other accounts of the wider gang wars put the toll into the hundreds. The violence didn't stay in Tolyatti. It followed the money to Moscow. In June 1994, Boris Berezovsky climbed into his Mercedes outside his company headquarters. As the car moved off, a hidden bomb detonated. The blast killed his driver. Berezovsky himself survived, with minor injuries. And the killing reached the people who tried to report on it. In the early 2000s, 2 editors of a Tolyatti newspaper investigating the city's crime were murdered, one after the other. Meanwhile, the factory itself was rotting from the inside. By the end of 1996, AvtoVAZ had become the single largest tax debtor in all of Russia, owing the state something on the order of $2.4 billion. The people's car had been captured. The question now was whether anyone could pull it back from the edge. Chapter 6. Sold for 1 ruble. By the 2000s, with a new government in Moscow tightening its grip, the wildest of the violence faded. But AvtoVAZ was exhausted. Saddled with debt, outdated cars and a battered reputation, it needed a rescue. And once again, it would come from the West. In 2008, the French carmaker Renault bought a quarter of AvtoVAZ. Over the following decade, Renault and its partner Nissan steadily increased their hold, until by 2018, the French company controlled the Soviet giant outright. Renault did what the factory could never do alone. It modernized. It brought in a respected European designer and launched genuinely modern models like the Lada Vesta. In 2018, for the first time in roughly a decade, AvtoVAZ turned a profit. The recovery would last barely 3 years. In February 2022, Russia invaded Ukraine. Western sanctions slammed down, and the foreign suppliers AvtoVAZ now depended on began to vanish. Within weeks, the factory's lines fell silent, starved of the imported semiconductors a modern car requires. Renault, as one of the largest Western companies still operating in Russia, faced enormous pressure. And so, in May 2022, it walked away. Renault sold its controlling stake in AvtoVAZ to a Russian state research institute for a reported price of 1 single ruble, keeping only an option to buy it back within 6 years. The cost of that exit on Renault's books, a write-down of around 2.2 billion euros. The Soviet Union's car factory, modernized by the French, was back in the hands of the Russian state for the price of nothing. And then came the most telling detail of all. To keep building cars without Western parts, the Russian government temporarily relaxed its own safety and emissions rules. The first cars off the revived line, a stripped-down version of the Lada Granta, reportedly shipped without airbags, without anti-lock brakes, without modern emissions controls. A car being built in 2022 with the safety of a vehicle from decades earlier. And there was a bitter irony buried in the fine print. Renault had walked away for a single ruble, but its option to return would be anything but cheap. By 2025, Russian officials were signaling that buying back into AvtoVAZ would cost the French company well over $1 billion. Out for a ruble, back for $1 billion. Today, AvtoVAZ survives, owned by the Russian state, building Ladas once more. But its world has changed again. Cut off from European parts, it has turned increasingly to China, trading one foreign dependence for another. And in its own home market, Chinese brands have flooded in, seizing a huge share of Russian car sales and squeezing the very factory that once had no competition at all. The people's car has outlived the country that created it, the system that protected it, and the gangsters who bled it. It was built to carry a communist superpower into the modern age. It became a symbol of Soviet pride, then of post-Soviet chaos, and finally of a country once again turning inward. More than 30 million cars, half a century. One factory on the Volga that was, by turns, a miracle, a battlefield, and a bargaining chip sold for a single coin. That's the strange afterlife of the people's car. If you want to know how another Soviet industrial giant rose and fell, there's a story waiting for you on screen now. And if you're new here, this is what we do, every time, at Iron Curtain Industries. We'll see you next time.